Good Shabbos. In 1991, the manager of Brazil's television network came to the Rebbe and said, I have come especially from Brazil to the Rebbe to ask advice. How can I get my children to conduct themselves appropriately, properly? So I'll tell you what the Rebbe answered them. But first, in this week's Torah portion, we read how the names of Moshe and Aaron's parents, Amram and Yocheved. Well, already last week we read about Moshe, and Hashem chooses Moshe. But then his mother is called the mother of the child. It does a daughter of Levi. It doesn't say who she actually was. This week we're introduced to her. What is the storyline? When Moshe Rabbeinu finally comes to the Jewish people, to the elders of the Jewish people, and he says, God has sent me to take you out of Egypt. And he says, he uses terminology. He uses terminology that they had a tradition, that this is what the Redeemer, that this is their terminology the Redeemer will use to take them out of Egypt. What terminology are we talking about? This is a terminology used by Jacob and Joseph and Jacob, who said this is the term that the Redeemer is going to use. And now they hear it. The Torah tells us, Vayaminu, they believed. They believed that Moshe indeed was the Redeemer. And Moshe says, come along with me now. We're going to Pharaoh and we're going to ask him and we're going to tell him to let the Jewish people go. And so Moshe and Aaron and all the elders are coming towards the palace. But all of a sudden, we read that the only ones who actually come to Pharaoh, Moshe and Aaron. What happened to the elders? Rashi told us they slipped away. The Medrash expresses this in a quite, gives us some gory details. As they come to the gateway of Pharaoh's palace, they see literally scattered bodies on the side, crucified bodies on another side, amputated limbs all around. You could imagine the trepidation and the fear that overcame the Jewish elders. And so they said, we're not going any further. And they left. And the only ones who came to Pharaoh were Moshe and Aaron. Now the question is, how did they have the fortitude? How did they have the strength of character? How did they have the faith? How were they not gripped by an incredible fear of seeing sights like this? So the Torah therefore tells us, you know who Moshe and Aaron's parents were? It was Amram and Yocheved. Who are Amram and Yocheved? Amram, the Talmud tells us, was one of 4 people in biblical history who died only because Adam ate of the tree of knowledge. In other words, he himself had no sins, and himself did not deserve, so to speak, death, other than because death was decreed upon the world through the sin of Adam. And then, when Pharaoh made the decree that all firstborns should be thrown into the river, Amram says, what's the point of having children? And so he separated from his wife. And when all the Jewish people saw that he separated from his wife, they separated from their wives. Then little Miriam, Amram's daughter, who was now 5, 6 years old, approaches him and says, your decree is worse than Pharaoh's. Pharaoh only decreed on the boys, but you're going to stop the birth of even little Jewish girls. And Amram listened to his daughter, remarried or reconnected with his wife Yocheved, and therefore Moshe was born. Wow, what a humility for him to listen to his little girl after having taken this act, which probably was not done flippantly, of saying, what's the point of bringing children into a world where they're going to be killed by Pharaoh? And then having the humility and the faith to once again remarry based on the true perspective of a 6-year-old, that's Amram. Now, Yocheved is the woman that we read about who were the midwives, that Pharaoh approaches and says, when you see a baby boy being born, you shall kill him. And of course, what did the midwives do? They did not listen. Not only did they not kill, they did whatever they could to help the Jewish women have their children. And Pharaoh calls them. He says, why didn't you listen to me? And imagine when they came to Pharaoh, they probably would have seen the same scene that the elders saw in front of the palace of Pharaoh. And they came to him and they gave him an excuse that the Jewish women have babies before. They don't need midwives. They are their own midwives. When we come, it's already, everything's been done. They had no fear from Pharaoh and did what was necessary to be done. This the Torah teaches us is you want to know how Moshe and Aaron were the way they were because they had parents like Amram and Yocheved. And this the Rebbe said to the TV manager in Brazil. He says, if you and your wife will conduct yourself appropriately in listening to Hashem's guidance and be a true inspiration, a true what we call dugma chaya, someone who gives the appropriate role model, someone who's an appropriate role model, then that's how you can best make sure that your children will act appropriately as you wish in their daily life. And then when you talk to them, you will have an impact because it's coming from people who they respect, coming from those they see conduct themselves appropriately. And so we're all of us care about giving over our values to our children. When we behave in an appropriate manner and when we interact and do the right thing and do the thing, conduct ourselves as Hashem wants of us, that is the best way to communicate our values, Yiddishkeit, commitment to the next generation. Good Shabbos.